Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Mage Errant, Book 5, The Siege of Skyhold, chapters 36 through 42. Bombardment, slingstones, endless cacophony, midwinter approaches, clash of the powers, wardfall, and among the ranks of the mighty. In these chapters, everything gets breached, and the Havathi are here in Skyhold. I don't know why I didn't expect this to happen so soon, but I'll be honest, I didn't even know if it would happen at all. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning this episode. Dan is here in the chat to watch me go, I didn't think they would ever get into Skyhold like a friggin' noob, but I'll be perfectly honest with you guys. I sort of thought the siege would break at the very end of the book, and they would get in like as the book was wrapping, basically, and we would go into the next book having to deal with the implications of that. So them getting in here truly was unexpected as a reader, because there's just a sort of rhythm that I'm kind of used to with the way it's not even like so much well, I guess it technically counts as a trope. I'm not really sure, to be honest, what the like qualifications are for tropes, but I am used to books, especially when they are serialized, and especially when they are like a larger number of books and they are sort of smaller books individually. Things will often just end on a real cliffhanger sort of moment in order to pull you into the next one. And these books haven't done that so much. They've had pretty conclusive endings, but you know, as a series continues, authors can sometimes like start doing that a little bit more, because the sort of trend is the longer a series goes on, the later books become longer and longer and then even longer, and it's just almost always the case. So I wouldn't be surprised if somebody who's written a lot of books in a series starts breaking off in order to kind of keep that under control. And I know like Dan had to commission a lot more chapters for the final book, because that one is by far the longest one. I think, Dan, you said it's like 3 times the length of the first book, something like that. And he has added some episodes to his commission so that I have like a lot more time to talk about things by the time we get there, which I think will be really good. So, yeah, this actually kind of worked out, because like I said last week, I was supposed to have read chapter 36 last week. Last week, because it was Thursday. And I ended on 35, not realizing, because I like misremembered. And this sort of worked out because bombardment starts off the battle, and that really sets the tone for the rest of this section of chapters. Almost 4 times the first book. Wow. Dan's telling me the length of the last Bells, the Lord of the Bells, something with Lord of the Bells. But yeah, I really, that's a lot longer. That's crazy. Although I say that and I'm like on Waybound, which probably is at least 3 times longer than Unsold was. So we start off in bombardment, and I'm thinking Kanderon is about to like save them from a straight up attack. And it's sort of like it's an attack in a way that wasn't what I thought, but she's got Sabe and Hugh on her back, and she is flying. And I mean that in the metaphorical sense, as well as the literal sense, figurative sense, not metaphorical, figurative sense. She is going so fast that people are getting like buffeted around and books are going flying because she's having to like go through the library. And there is a series of tunnels that she has made with a pocket space that are folded into these tunnels so that she can get through them even though she is humongous. And this is how she gets like in and out of things. And he was thinking to himself that she probably has tunnels like this going all through the mountain, which I have to think is going to wind up being pretty important. Everything with the planar spaces, the extra planar spaces, I feel like I only grasp it about 30% of what the author intends me to understand about it. And I'm going to actually ask this question here. So there's a moment later on where Talia pulls out the knife that Hugh had given her as a gift from her planar space, which is the tattoo around her mouth. So it looks like she pulls things out of her mouth. And it's described that the tattoo lights up and becomes visible when it's used. And I am sort of confused as to why that it was allowed to be put around her mouth, because I thought the whole thing was sort of supposed to be secret. Like, Kanderon doesn't want them out using their planars, or she doesn't want them out right after they've gotten their tattoos because they won't have faded to invisibility yet. And she doesn't want anybody to see them or know about them. But if it lights up around Talia's mouth every time she uses it, I feel like that's just the same as them seeing it once it's been completed. So I don't really understand why she's permitted to have it in a place that's so visible. And like, isn't there something they could have done to make it so that it doesn't light up at all? Is there anything to sort of hide that? Because it feels like there could not possibly be. Right. Dan is saying she requested to have it around her mouth because it was the only place it could go with all her tattoos. Yes, but the secrecy, I would think, would be a lot more important than just having one or figuring out a way around it. I mean, if she got a tattoo on her bones, put a planar affinity or planar tattoo on her bones as well. Fit that in there somehow. It just seems like are they just kind of going with, we'll pretend that Talia is the only one who has that tattoo? Like, it's only her and we're gonna, you know what I'm saying? Like, I just would think if it's supposed to be secret enough that they're not even allowed to leave the room for an hour until they fade, that having one that literally lights up on her face, that feels like it would be a problem. And it's kind of wild to me that there's not been any like effort to tamp down the visibility of it when it's in use. Something to like make the light not shine or the light be invisible. I don't know. But hi Eduardo. Eduardo's in the chat. Dan says, I don't think keeping it a secret is like more important than the utility when the Havathi are besieging, but they never give a direct discussion of it. Yeah, I guess that's the thing, is that they're like getting these in preparation for the siege. But, you know, it's just like the time that we see her use it here, it's literally just to pull a knife out to be like, does anybody want this? So it just feels like frivolous. And I know like there's a practical consideration here that's very real. But I was very confused by it because it seems like otherwise we're being pretty careful about it. Like, Alustin doesn't even want anybody to know he has a tattoo like this at all because he likes to pretend he's pulling everything out of his bag and that he's got like a Mary Poppins style bag. But yeah, anyway, it was something that kind of confused me because it seemed to me like it was a big deal. And Eduardo's saying maybe the tattoos only glow up for a bit when using them versus staying on for a long time after having them put on, so it's a lot harder to analyze. I mean, my thought was that you just don't want anybody to know that they're accessing stuff from a, like, magical, like, a planar space, and that it's supposed to be sort of, they're pulling things from an area that it is surprising that it fits, but nobody's really able to pin down how they're doing it. So I wouldn't think that the analysis would even be a consideration, that it would be the problem. I was thinking seeing a flare like that at all signals exactly how she's doing this, whether or not it's like giving them the exact tattoo pattern. It's still clearly signaling like, oh, it looks like she pulled it out of her mouth, but that tattoo, she's clearly doing something magically and reaching into a different space. So I don't know. It's just something that caught my attention. Dan says the Scrimshaw ward also glows blue when in use, so it does hide it up to a bit, assuming that she's going to be using that when she pulls things out of her space. But that's, like, I would say going to be the minority of the time that she's using it. I know it's meant to be, like, good for battle, but it would be something that's just practically useful outside of battle just as much, if not more so, I would think. So Miss T says the exact tattoo pattern is the secret. It would say how it's done. Okay. So, okay. I was thinking that it was that they exist at all, but if it's the actual pattern, I guess. Okay. I mean, whatever. It doesn't really matter that. I thought that there was going to be like more of a reasoning for this instead of just kind of like, well, you know, but I guess that's kind of what it is. So Kanderon, she flies up and brings them all to the top of the mountain, and they're outside. And Headmaster Tarek, former traitor Anders Velsiraf, I like the way that that's worded, the ceramic mage, Eden Slane, and a woman Hugh didn't recognize. Ceramic mage is kind of dope. Like, he winds up standing on ceramic plates and sort of floating around on those, which I'm sure that they're a weak spot. Like, if somebody breaks them and you just fall, that really fucking sucks for you. But also, maybe if you are a ceramic mage, they're not as easy to break as, you know, like, I think that this is sort of a fascinating one. I'm just really into the ones that seem like a somewhat common material, but are specialized enough to get like a bit creative with in a way that I wouldn't automatically think of doing with other materials. And the glass mage thing just remains so upsetting, you guys. I am not going to lie. So Kanderon tells them to stay. This shouldn't be violent, but just in case, Hugh, if things go wrong, set off a starfire beacon and run for the stairs with Sebe. They're sending Amalda Vale. And Amalda, it turns out, is like she's described as having a kindly face. And I think that this is meant to be really taken at face value because Anders calls her honorable. You know, that she's like a badass, but she's not a fuck. And I'm sort of interested to see whether that is true. I think based on what we see of her in these chapters, it seems to be. And I kind of enjoy that. I'm always a fan of, yeah, they're technically our enemy, but also they seem to be a person that you would be friends with if it weren't for the way things shook out kind of situation. I'm a big fan of that. So in that respect, I think it's interesting. But if she does turn out to be sort of awful, there's something to be said for people who like manage to give off a very kindly air and then turn out to be terrible. And there is just something gut-wrenching about when that's pulled off really effectively. Those of you who have seen Penny Dreadful, with Eva Green, there is a storyline with the Frankenstein character where there's a dude who's like apparently helping him out, and spoilers for Penny Dreadful, which I covered a while back now. But it turns out that this person is not being helpful, but they seem so kind and warm and good-hearted. They cast somebody really well who, when it turns out that they are awful, there's something so much more disturbing and upsetting about it. So anyway, it's just a really, I'm curious to see. So it says, the figure came to a halt in front of them, hovering in midair just outside the distance gradient barrier. And he recognizes that her armor is made of ether crystal. And he sees her later, like, coming out of the shadows, and he thinks that it's a figure made of shadows. And then he's like, oh, there she is. Okay. So Kanderon, in this back and forth, she just won't quite let me root for her all the way. Kanderon, in this back and forth, is very petty in a bitchy, like, kind of way that feels counterproductive, and like it's just being done for her to vent her frustration and try and needle the other party. But this is not a party that, to me, seems like needling would be... It's not that it wouldn't work at all. We see that Amalda gets irritated and angry at some of the things that Kanderon says, but she does have the self-control to keep that from influencing too much what she says and does. So it's not the sort of thing that, like, if I say the right thing, this extremely immature person is going to fly off the handle and I can use this to manipulate them. It really, really does just seem like Kanderon wants to give somebody the finger and Amalda just happens to be here. So it starts off with her, like, Duark Locke sends his greetings. And Kanderon says, I'm surprised Ikola let Locke off his leash enough to lead your little siege. And Amalda controls herself and is like, we don't need to break this mountain and hurt people. Just give us the splinter. And there's a whole back and forth. The headmaster gets involved as well. And they're basically like, we have the custody of a lot of other city-destroying weapons, and people have seemed fine with that. Why are you guys so weird about us having this one? And she claims because you've used it before, and because it cannot be defended against. There's nothing to be done if somebody decides to use it. And Kanderon says, I know what you're intending to do, and I don't intend to let that happen. If Havath's masters don't use it here on Anastas, they will either use it elsewhere or threaten its use for their own gain. And this is so rough, because as soon as she says, I know what they intend to do with it and that they're going to use it, I felt like a bit of a fucking goon for kind of like on a very surface level without giving it that much thought. I never really sat down and was like, what does Havath plan to do with it? I was just sort of willing to accept, we just don't want you to have it, because frankly, that's not an unheard of motivation for things like this. You know, I think that's a real thing, that great powers, and I don't mean that in the context of this book, but the overall, you know, the great powers in what that means in the actual real world. They may not plan to use a weapon, but they at least want it under their care and not in the hands of an enemy for very obvious reasons. So I was willing to just accept that. But then here, Amalda is like, we don't have masters. That's the point of the Havathi people, is that we're not letting ourselves be run by folks like you. To which Kanderon is like, oh, babe, sweetie, honey, child, that is such horseshit. And the fact that you are saying this to me and you seem to be sincere tells me that they aren't telling you anything, which is like, I'm embarrassed for you. So I'm definitely not giving it to you. That's that. And y'all can just throw whatever you got at our wards, and I say, bring it. And Amalda is like, you know what? Fine. Fuck you. You asked for it. And then we go to Kanderon saying, wait and watch. And there's this moment again. Everyone promptly settled down, though Hugh was a little shocked that none of the council members protested. Kanderon was, by far, the most powerful member of the Skyhold Council, but she wasn't a despot. She still had to maneuver through the politics inside the mountain. None of the councilors made a peep in protest, though. I don't think she has to maneuver the way you think she does, babe. You know, like, I think that there are some checks and balances in place, but ultimately, if Kanderon wants to do something, I don't see them being able to keep that from happening. And I think they're all pretty aware of that. And I was genuinely surprised that Hugh was surprised, because I thought we had sort of established that it was like understood. And I think Hugh is just giving her a lot more credit for fairness and equal voices to all than she has ever really indicated she's interested in. I don't know where that's coming from, other than perhaps just personal feelings about her. So let's see, everyone. Okay. Then in the distance, the Havathi ward rippled as something bright passed through it. A fireball, one that must have been the size of a horse at least, to be visible from this distance in the sky. And it flies toward them. It hits the ward. It does not go through. And then all kinds of other things begin to hit. And it lasts and lasts. And Hugh asks, how many siege mages do they have? To which Anders replies, hundreds, if not thousands. Their army and mage corps outnumber the entire population of Skyhold, which is truly something. That's insane. And Hugh looks over and sees a hungry smile on Kanderon's face, and I'm like, okay, but later we find out Kanderon underestimated these people. So that look, while intimidating in the moment, looking back, you're kind of like, ooh, you were real overconfident, weren't you? Unless this is all part of her plan, but it doesn't feel like that's true. So then we have a kind of bit of downtime, because we're dealing with a couple of birthdays in a row. We have Sabbe's and we have Godric's, which are pretty close together. But there's a moment where Graham is asking, do humans and Gorgons, like, is it possible for them to actually, to which Alessin says, oh, yes, indeed. And I'm kind of starting to assume that maybe the Gorgon incident might have been something that involved him hooking up with a Gorgon. We've still never heard about what that is. But this whole section is really an interesting thing that I feel is written pretty well in terms of its effectiveness at getting one thing across. And that is how utterly endless this assault on the wards is. And it's meant to be demoralizing. And we are in Hugh's POV at one point, and he's like, it's working. Because it reminds me of, like, the air raids that used to happen I think France had them as well, but I always think of like London. And it wasn't even necessarily to kill anybody, although that certainly happened. It was simply to wear down infrastructure and the morale of the people, making them flee and, have to stay in the country and completely break up the rhythm of their lives and fuck with production in factories. It's like a much more spread out sort of effect. But the idea of just like being inside this mountain and this noise relentlessly chipping away at things in the background all the time, it sounds god awful. I am somebody who's pretty sensitive to sound. It's like if you yell and startle me, the kind of like adrenaline rush I get, it's enough to almost make me burst into tears. Like, it's not fun or funny. It is almost like painful feeling. And that is like something that I really struggle with having the dogs, is when they're like whining and crying, it is next to impossible for me to tune that sound out. There are some things I can tune out entirely. But there are some noises that it's just like, it gets to me in such a way that it's impossible to ignore. And I have to imagine that this would wear me down pretty fucking badly, because it is days and days and days of this. And so Sabe's having her birthday party. Eventually we have Godric's, which is like extra depressing because everybody is attempting to sort of be fun and cool and act like it's not happening, but it's not convincing. We have a convo between Hugh and Godric about, what's his face? Tristan, who is flirting so relentlessly with Godric that he doesn't really know what to do, because he's feeling like he wants something more serious, but he's not uninterested either. And even his father later is sort of like, Godric, what are you doing? Because it seems like you kind of want to try this, but you're also being real weird about it. And Hugh notices Loarna's there because he senses a spot where he was about to step out of the way where there's apparently nobody there. And it turns out she's here. She came to the party because he invited her, but she just has a difficult time with people, but she likes to be around them. So they have a nice little chat together and commiserate on how difficult it is to deal with people. We have this bit where Mackerel thinks people are a type of tree. He draws pine cones a lot. And I'm really enjoying this. I've made a lot of comparisons to this cast of characters and the characters of Cradle, and I stand by that. It didn't even occur to me either, but the whole thing, Lyndon has a complete inability to connect with Madra, it seems at first. And then once he starts to get on his way, it's through pacting with an animal, which is very similar to what's going on with Hugh. And then Mackerel feels very Dross-ish, but it's a different thing because Mackerel seems a lot more rudimentary in his ability to communicate. When Dross is discovered, he's got a lot more capability to have a full conversation. And Mackerel isn't there. So he's communicating in these chapters with Hugh via pictures of pine cones with hats on them, to which Hugh has to sort of infer whether that's confirmation or what he's trying to express with that. So they have a moment here with Thaddeus, who is basically dealing with some PTSD over their house being broken off a cliff during the whole thing in is it Therastel? The one where Ataerg attacked. That was Therastel, right? And Hugh is finally wait, why don't I just make a ward to kind of keep the sound down? I could have done that ages ago. It didn't even occur to me. And he also gives Thaddeus his sling and those like spelled rocks, I guess is the way you want to call them. But it's the thing that he used initially and wasn't prepared to ward stones. That's what they are. He wasn't prepared with how delicate they were. And when Kanderon finds out that he was using a weapon like this, she's just like, do you know how like close you came to this shit just exploding and blowing your entire nutsack off? Like, seriously. And I really enjoy how Thaddeus is like, are you sure you can part with this? And he was low-key like, I really don't need this anymore, bruh. Like, I'm not saying it's not a good weapon. You'll be able to use it, but come on. And he invites Thaddeus to watch him put up the ward for the sound. And I really liked that he offers this because, especially since Thaddeus is so affected by the sound, if he can like absorb what he was doing, he could use this to protect himself in the future from something that seems to be pretty triggering for him. And Hugh is very gratified at the fact that Thaddeus is so focused and is thinking to himself, like, you know what? I'm going to be a little bit more hands-on with the mentoring thing. Like, it's just a moment of it feeling like this is more meaningful than I was giving it credit for. And I really like that because I have dealt with with mentoring kids before in groups. There was like a summer program in California that I volunteered for, being the head of a cabin, and it was kids that stayed for several weeks. So you got to know them really well. And then I was in an after school program for kids that had nowhere to go right after school. Like, home was either unsafe or unavailable. And so you gave them a place to go and they wouldn't be on the street getting into trouble. And that kind of moment is real. And it's astonishing how much it will buoy you when everything else is really bad. And I feel this way about like dealing with the puppies as well. So I imagine this is what it's like to be a parent. But you have such bad moments that are really like, what am I doing? I'm fucking up. I'm not a good parent. This kid isn't prepared. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm failing them. And then they come through with like a thing that they got right, that they're crediting you for, or just acknowledging they got it from you. And it's like enough to completely make all this other horseshit worth it. And it's like 20% that moment to 80% garbage. And that 20% is so powerful and so good that it still feels worthwhile. And it's really wild to me how that can even be possible. Because if you told me about 20% of the time it feels super rewarding, I'd be like, get fucked. Absolutely not. But now that I'm sort of in this thinking about it, I'm like, no, yeah. Like, even if you can only help and do something effective 20% of the time, why wouldn't that count? Why wouldn't that be important? And I just hope that he takes this even more seriously going forward, because it is a very important job. And I know how hard it is for him to deal with people. So I'm not blaming him for not taking it seriously at first, because he doesn't really like see the practical aspects of it. But hopefully now he's getting it a little bit more. So let me go into chapter 38, Endless Cacophony. The bombardment never let up. Day and night they kept hammering. And it says, there's this moment here that I thought was kind of interesting. Skyhold had a handful of siege mages, but there had been little demand for siege mages from Skyhold in the past. Hiring normal Skyhold mercenary mages was easily excused by a nation. They could be easily claimed to be for defense, construction, or for hunting monsters. Hiring siege mages, however, was an immediate recipe for suspicion from your neighbors and was practically an invitation for attack. So, thanks to a simple absence of economic demand, Skyhold lacked the ability to exchange siege spells. Wow, say exchange siege spells with Havath 3 times fast. So yeah, this is the part where they're starting to like be kind of outplayed, and it is really killing morale. Ward crafters found themselves badly overworked crafting noise wards. The endless project was just made worse by the fact that all but the most skillfully crafted sound wards degraded rapidly. Wards dealt poorly with sound and vibration. Hugh put in all the time he could to crafting and repairing sound wards through the mountain, but it was never enough. He found himself looking forward most to Emerson Dree's classes. The sound mage could easily suppress the noise of the bombardment. In the meantime, other attempts redoubled. They failed, but the frequency and variety was really like wearing everybody down. I'm paraphrasing there. And they're still like trying to burrow in. I really enjoyed this bit. Headmaster Tarek dropped a boulder the size of a large dragon on them. Hugh was particularly amazed by that one. Archer couldn't have easily even lifted a boulder that size. Even Kanderon seemed mildly impressed. And later on, we see him like impress the shit out of Alustin. And Alustin is just like, how is he not a great power? Like, what the fuck? I'm pretty sure it was him. I may be mistaken, but I thought it was him. So yeah, I just really felt like the relentlessness of this was effective in the writing, and how I felt it and could imagine how exhausted by it everybody is, you know? So her and Hugh are together at one point, and they hear this sound, and I'm trying to find the spot. Here it is. The roars of a tornado replace the sounds of the bombardment. So they like go out the window, which they're thinking, like in retrospect, maybe that wasn't the smartest idea, but that's what they do. They see the tornado creeping toward them, and the wind mages are trying to hold it back, but it's not working. And then her tattoos begin to light up, and he's like, what's going on? And she says, that's what happens when somebody uses a lot of fire mana. And she points upward. The shimmer erupted in an absolutely massive column of fire, stretching from the top of Skyhold to the tornado. It passed straight through Skyhold's ward without disrupting it. Even 2/3 of the way down the mountain, Hugh could feel the heat of the fire pounding against his skin. The twisting, writhing column of fire was at least a ship's length in width and looked hot enough to melt steel. It impacted the tornado about 3/4 of the way up, and all the flame was immediately sucked into the funnel. The twisting column of flame dragged itself upward until it was punching into the amorphous cloud of sand atop the funnel. Then a fiery glow erupted from inside the tornado, and a heartbeat later it simply started to fall apart. Sand began falling back to the desert like rain, and the great column of flame simply cut out at the source. And Hugh is like, who the fuck did that? And she's like, my clan, Dodoy. And he's like, that's like great power level. Are you serious? And she's like, yeah, well, did you think that we like didn't deserve the reputation we have for being complete badasses? And Hugh is like, I mean, that's like communal power. That's not how great powers work. Talia scowled at him. Well, clearly it does. Did you think I was lying about the stories I told you about my family? Hugh felt his heart drop at Talia's angry expression, and he tried to think of some way to explain that he hadn't thought she was lying, that he just hadn't understood exactly the scale of Clan Castus's magic. Hugh felt himself starting to panic, felt part of his brain insist Talia was about to break up with him. Then Hugh realized he was being ridiculous and forced himself to calm down. And he says, I didn't think you were lying. I guess I just didn't really try hard enough to understand. I'm sorry. And it's a really interesting moment, just the way that he completely begins to freak out here. Felt very real to me. And also how he said something that it didn't occur to him. It was implying that he hadn't believed the stories that she had told. What this kind of reminded me of is like a guy hearing about a way a woman was treated. And he was told that this happened by his wife, who also experienced it. But he's hearing it from one of his other friends and is like, wait, he did that? And the wife being like, I told you that he did that. Did you just think I made it up? Why are you surprised? And it's just sort of putting it in the context of it happening to yet another person, realizing that it's like not a one-off, it's a pattern. The way that Hugh comes back with, I didn't try hard enough to understand. I thought that was a really good way to respond. Of like, it's not that I didn't believe you. It's that I didn't fully think through all of the implications of what you told me. And now that it's in front of my face, it's a lot scarier than I was giving it credit for when I was just hearing the story from one person in kind of a vacuum. And I know that's a weird comparison to make, but it's just what it sort of made me think of, because I understand how he wouldn't see the implication of what he was implying when he expressed surprise. But I also understand being Talia and feeling like I've talked a lot about my family being extremely strong, and I don't understand how this is surprising for you. And I also like the fact that like the fact that they communicate very directly, but it's still possible to misunderstand people even when you're really direct, you know? It's something that I recently had happen with Owen, where I had said something and he took this in a completely different way than I intended. And I literally didn't find out he had taken it that way for like months. And then later on, he was like, well, that one time you basically like threw it in my face at blank, blank, blank. And I'm like, I did what? What are you talking about? And he repeated back to me the thing. And I was like, well, that's not what I said. And he's like, well, it's basically what you said. And I was like, no. And I repeated what I had said. And he was like, how is that different? And we had to really hash it out word by word, what I had meant versus what he heard. And that the fact that I didn't mean it that way doesn't change. He took it that way. You can't just be like, well, since I didn't mean it that way, your feelings in response to it are completely invalid. It doesn't, like, they felt the way that they felt, and whether it was correct in quotes or not, that's still an effect that you've got to cope with. So anyway, I just sort of liked this like little interaction, and I thought it was interesting later on when Godric is sort of trying to like joke with Hugh about the fact that you and Talia just throw your emotions at each other, and not most people do not handle things that way. And Hugh was like, that's not what we do. And he's like, yes, it is. And most of us don't do that. I didn't see it that they did it that way either. But I guess, I don't know. I still kind of don't really see it. But I don't know. I'm surprised because Godric seems so direct to me that the fact that he sees it in those blunt terms, I did find a little bit surprising. So we have a conversation between Arthur and Godric again. And there is, I'm not going to get into this too much because I still have like a couple other chapters and I'm running out of time here. But the conversation, it's another moment of the two of them connecting really well, and his father just emphasizing that he wants Godric and his friends to be able to take care of themselves, asking him why he isn't interested in Tristan. And he says, do you feel like you owe Tristan and his family, and that's why you're resisting getting involved with him? Which I thought was an interesting concept, just not wanting to be in a romantic entanglement to somebody that you feel otherwise indebted to. I could understand that, you know? So let's see. Talia, hadn't, I'm getting the sentences mixed up. Most battle mages didn't consider a haircut an essential piece of battle preparation. Talia certainly hadn't, until she realized that her hair tended to drift out of her scrimshaw ward, so she'd asked Graham's wife to cut it for her. Somehow that had turned into a family gathering with almost all her brothers there. And I think that's kind of fun that she's like keeping her hair short at this point now. She wants to, you know, keep it close to herself within the ward so people can't grab onto it. And there's just a lot of teasing here. And this is when she like pulls that knife out and she's asking if anybody wants it. And they're like, wasn't that a gift from Hugh? And she says that she talked to him about it and he understands. And let's see, Talia picked up a hand mirror to examine her hair. It still jutted up wildly, but Hala had actually managed to force at least a little order into her hair. Looks absolutely terrifying, Rafe said. Like you're ready to murder someone, Tristan said. Preferably not one of us, Luthi concluded. Perfect, Talia said. So then we go to Hugh and Kanderon. And this is mostly Hugh telling her how he's doing, struggling a little bit. There's been a lot of work to do. Her reassuring him that they don't have to worry about the Havathi breaking through, that the siege inconveniences Skyhold, but it fucks up the Havathi a lot more, that midwinter is coming really shortly, and the vault will open, and they'll put the thing away, and they won't be able to get to it. And she gets a message in the midst of this. Havath just attacked Lothal and Sdapson with teams of great powers. Karna, Scythe, and the Gorgons drove off their 3 attackers, but they're still lurking at the borders. And he's like, well, if they are breaking up if they're fighting in other places, then that means it's good for us that they're not fighting here. And Kanderon says, all of the great powers reported at both attacks were ones our intelligence had indicated remained behind in Havath. So that means they're going to attack soon. And there are, further in the battle later, people that she had been told weren't working with them. So there's like a whole lot of information she's been getting that is not correct. And she tells Hugh to be careful, and he looks at her and says to be careful too, and presses his forehead against hers. And she's like a little bit taken aback by it and starts purring the way that she does with her head pressed against his for a moment. And it's very clear that she has to like sort of couch her concern for him. I won't have much free time before midwinter, so if I don't get to see you again before then, be careful, Hugh. I've put too much time and effort into you to lose my investment now. Clearly was about to say, I can't lose you too, like she would be upset. But she has to rework the sentence to be like, well, return on investment, you know. And I'm like, we know. We know, girl. We know that you have feelings, and I know that's super embarrassing, but there it is. So Sabe is about to go find Venta and ask her out, the Gorgon, but they get interrupted. She finds out that Venta's homeland was attacked and is like, I guess this isn't probably a great time to ask her out. And let's see, she set out for Alustin's office and pounded on the door for several minutes, but he must not have been there or in his rooms above his office. He'd probably already heard the news and was attending meetings about it. As Sabe turned away from Alustin's door, she felt a breeze in her hair and froze. It had been blowing in the opposite direction from Skyhold's ventilation, which always traveled from the heart of the mountain outwards. A smile slowly crept across Sabe's face. I don't know if I'm supposed to have understood why that was like something that made her smile, but I kept sort of waiting, and it's been mentioned like later on. I think it's Godric who says that for whatever reason airflow only goes out of Skyhold and not in, which is something that nobody can really like explain, but I don't know what that's about. So let's see. Going into chapter 40, we have, of course, again, Kanderon telling the Havathi, like, y'all ain't shit. You can come here and throw yourselves under my cartwheels if you feel like it. I don't really see the point, but go off. And she really is super confident. Like, everything she's saying, she believes. And it's not until later that you start to realize maybe she doesn't have it as under control as she thought. There's a moment with Thaddeus and the other kids that Hugh is mentoring showing up, and all of like Hugh's crew, Huey Crewis and the crew, they are having to convince these kids, yeah, you're super not ready. Like, you got to get the fuck out of here. This is not for you. I'm not trying to be like, oh, prove yourself. I'm dead ass serious. You will die. You gotta go. And I really liked the fact that Hugh sends Mackerel with them to ensure that they fucking like go where they need to be safe. Because I was expecting that he was just going to say go, and then we were going to have him round a corner later on, and there they are. And they didn't listen to him at all. Now that may still happen. I don't know how much Mackerel can make them do anything. But I'm going to at least give Hugh credit for that occurring to him and ensuring that there's something extra in place to try and like make sure they're safe. So this is when we go to Kanderon's POV, and she is about to engage in this attack. Dana Bruma, better known as Dana the Puppet, flew toward the mountain faster than any of the other Havathi great powers, entombed in her giant bronze sarcophagus, cast in the shape of an immobile suit of armor even bigger than Arthur's. And she was paralyzed as a child and figured out ways to use force affinity to move her body so that it just looked like she was actually moving it with her muscles and not with external, which is a wild thing to think about. And then she sees this like glass sphere made by glass mages. And this is something that she's like, I don't know how they pulled this off, but I can break it. And she does this whistling thing. And because it does break and it's not difficult, I was sort of ready to be like impressed. But that's what makes Kanderon go, oh, fuck. Because the fact that it is somewhat simple to break indicates that this is not their most high caliber weapon. Which, what else have they got? What are they hiding? And she is like kind of getting distracted, wondering what else they've got up their sleeve. So the whole thing, I just thought it was interesting being in her POV and how many like parts of this kind of come as a surprise to her. Here it is. The 9th remained lurking in the Havathi war camp, guarding their command post. Along with the 5 powers that had attacked Lothal and Sadapsin, this was far more than her intelligence indicated Havath should have been able to levy in this war. To her knowledge, Havath only had a dozen great powers outside their liches, and she knew for a fact quite a few of them remained in Havath itself. And yeah, this is just a really chilling thing to know as a reader, considering how much faith the rest of our friends have in her, and knowing that they aren't working with this information yet. I don't know if they will, but they aren't yet. So this is when Hugh starts to see the rifts in the defensive wards. There are breaks now, like they're getting through them. And eventually a bunch of dragons start to like push their way through those cracks, which is really scary. So Hugh is starting to create some wards that are meant to deflect attention. And Godric is like, those are pretty weak seeming. And he says, and this made sense to me, if they're not that strong, they're much less noticeable and therefore much more effective. I was like, that's a really good point, because you can actually detect the power itself in the really strong ones, which is what gives it away. That's what you're doing. Then we go to Alustin's POV, and it says Alustin had long disparaged Skyhold's preferred teaching methods. They generated endless ranks of mediocre battle mages who specialized in extraordinarily unoriginal projectile attack spells. They were next to useless on their own and lacked precious adaptability to changing circumstances. There was one area, however, in which Alustin had grudging respect for them: the mass volley. And so they've got 2,000 mages just sending fucking hits out and tearing shit up because of their sheer numbers. And the whole way that this like unfolds, I am waiting for him to use whatever this new affinity is that he's been developing. And I sort of thought it might happen here. It may still happen in this battle, but it doesn't happen here. Out here, it is Headmaster Tarek. Hundreds of boulders ripped themselves from the sides of Skyhold, the smallest the size of a horse-drawn carriage, many the size of a house. Tarek launched them all in a colossal volley out into the endless erg. And yeah, he is just truly impressed by this. The whole thing is like devastating. With a single spell, Tarek had just taken more lives than in the entirety of the war so far. Woo! That's pretty intense. We find out about like Talia's involvement with Bonefire, which is something that they're using in these explosives here. And individual blasts, like not so effective, but altogether completely like wrecking them, which is what happens. Like if you do enough of a small thing, if you do it in great enough numbers, it doesn't matter that it's small. It is going to ruin your goddamn day. So then we go into 42, and this is mostly Arthur. He is in a battle against Iton the Gardener, a dragon, I think it is, who has like plant armor. And I thought, is it a dragon? I'm trying to find the spot here where it's described. Maybe it's not. Draconic plant armor. So I think that's what made me think he was himself a dragon, and I'm assuming that's correct. This plant armor sounds really, really cool. And Arthur's sort of excited to go up against him because he's like, I just have always wondered how I would measure up to this person. And it seems for a moment like Iton is getting the drop on him a little bit and starts to gloat a tad. But Arthur pulls some fucking iron out of his his space, his extraplanar space. In the blink of an eye, the hammer shaft extended itself, piercing all the way through the plant dragon and into the stone below it. There it is, plant dragon. Amazing. The vines grasped onto Arthur for a few heartbeats longer, then Iton's armor slumped to the ground and began to unravel. And Arthur is like, fuck. Because he has never taken the title of great power, but Aitin was a great power, and Arthur just killed his ass right in front of a lot of people, and that's kind of case closed. Like, he is a great power now, and everyone's gonna see this about him, and there's nothing he can do to, like, protect Godric any further. And he is feeling a bit of a way about it. I love, though, that Godric's, like, watching and applauding from the sidelines. Bless him. And he's applauding with fucking metal gauntlets on. So Hugh sort of turns to him like, ow, man, because it's really loud. And when he turns, that's when he sees Amalda Vale. And I was sort of convinced by her little speech here. Amalda is basically, because Talia, I think, says, what are you going to do? Try to convince us to join you? I sort of thought Amalda would be like, no, and then just attack. But she's like, yeah, because you're fucking kids. And look, I get that you don't think you're kids, but like, you're fucking kids. And I would really rather not kill children in this fight if you don't mind. Like, would you not press us and make this something we have to do? And I think Sabe is like, you know, it doesn't seem like all of your people are that concerned about killing kids. And Amalda's very honest and is just like, I know that there are bastards on my side also. Like, it's just groups of people, and they're gonna be people, and some of them are shits. But I am here to say, please don't make us fight kids. And Sabe is like, can we confer? But then attacks in response really quickly. Must we really do this? Amalda said. Do you really think we're just going to walk away and let you threaten the people we care about? Sabe demanded. I suppose it does sound a bit foolish when you put it like that, Amalda said. The Archmage sighed sadly, and her helmet went black again. An instant later, the hallway's shadows and stones erupted into spikes, which is pretty scary. And I'm wondering what ward Hugh had in place, because I am assuming the instant he saw her, he was like, alrighty, time to get warding. But that is the end of the section. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. That startled me. Sam is right here, and I think he just woke himself up from a dream. But I'm pretty proud that I was able to make it through all those chapters, but they're very like action heavy, so I don't need to go too in depth on each of them. I think I managed it pretty well. Yeah, so I'm really interested to see what happens next. I like Amalda, despite myself, and I feel sort of bad because Kanderon is clearly holding her in some contempt. And I think that she may be like pretty good-hearted and just not fully informed, you know? I always feel bad when that happens because I can fucking relate. You know, I think a lot of us who have learned about a little bit more about the way the world works the past decade or so can understand what it's like for your heart to be in the right place and you are just kind of ignorant and too ignorant to know you're ignorant. It's relatable. All right, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you guys again so much for joining me. Thank you, Dan, for commissioning this. Appreciate you a lot. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.